Well, welcome to the 2021 Regents Cup quarterfinals. Congratulations to all of our contestants for your excellent work so far. The Regents Cup provides us with an opportunity to engage in Oxford-style debate on a topic related to free speech. And the prompt that we will be using for this quarterfinal round reads, "There are certain texts with offensive language or messages that should be banned from being used in a curriculum." So once again, there are certain texts with offensive language or messages that should be banned from being used in a curriculum. So let's talk about how the Oxford debate is structured. There are 3 rounds. In the first round, each team will make a case that lasts between 6 and 7 minutes. I'm going to, at the 6-minute mark, I'm just going to raise my finger and try and get your attention. At the 7-minute, I will interrupt you. And so the affirmative will go first, followed by the negative team. And then we enter, oh, okay, is that a question?
Yeah, I just had a question. The wording we were given says that there are certain texts with offensive languages or messages that should be banned from the library or use in a curriculum. Which resolution are we going under?
Okay, thank you for saying that. Show of hands. Okay, so Akash, you had the same, I assume. And Christian, what did you have?
So we initially got the same resolution that everyone's talking about that isn't this one, but then it was altered after the initial release.
To the one that I read?
Okay, yeah. Okay, that's fine.
Okay, I'm going to make a prompt decision here. Is there anybody who would object to including have prepared material related to a library?
We're fine with not talking about libraries, like, if that's okay. If that's really
that proposal. Is
I think that was just an issue on our end where there was a miscommunication and we didn't incorporate that into the top of our document. That's okay.
So is everybody okay if library is not part of the formal proposition prompt? Any objections?
Yeah, I think we're good with that for sure.
Okay. Yeah. So there are certain texts with offensive language or messages that should be banned from being used in a curriculum. We have our 3 rounds. As I said, we have our first round where we have the affirmative case and then the negative case, 6 to 7 minutes. I'll stop you after 7 minutes. In the second round, we have more of a discussion. And for this, we invite the debaters to ask each other questions, to ask for clarifications. We also invite the judges to ask questions, but here is the request is judges, please put your questions in the chat room and I will moderate those questions for you. So put the questions in the chat room and I will ask the debaters those questions when they come up. All right, let's take this time to introduce our judges. First, we have Susan Bansack, the Chief Executive Officer of DMB Associates. We have the Honorable Bill Gates, Supervisor, Maricopa County District 3, Maricopa County Administration. Molly Green, Senior Director of Arizona Government Relations and Public Policy, the Salt River Project. Jonathan Patton, former Arizona State Senator. And Jade Richardson, the new product development engineer at W.L. Gore and Associates. Truly, we want to thank all of our judges for taking time out of your week, out of your day to participate in this important event. You are contributing to higher education, and so the gratitude is absolutely sincere. So we are ready to go, I think.
Sorry, we just checked with our coach the information that they gave, and they said that the resolution that was changed, I don't want to keep interrupting, I'm sorry about this. They said that it was changed to include library use, the change that was made to include libraries.
Okay.
I don't want to like,
No, so let's go back to our question. What we're going to do is no, this is fine. We're going to invite agreement. What we're looking for here is assent through the avoidance of dissent. Does anybody here object to a student in the debate process referencing libraries as part of the prompt? So you are free to reference libraries. So I think this is important for the judges. If somebody begins talking about library, they should not have points deducted based on that. Is that okay? Any objection from the judges? Is that okay with you, Joshua? Oops, you're on mute.
sorry to harp on that, but yes.
No, that's fine. Here we are. Okay, are we ready? So we are going, okay, good. We're going to start with the affirmative, and you are on.
All right. Anyone not ready?
We can hear you.
Perfect. If your child came home one day and told you that their teacher forced them to read detailed descriptions of sexual assault, incest, and rape, what would your reaction be? Horror? Disgust? Maybe anger? Well, unfortunately, this hasn't been a hypothetical for many across the United States. A series of schools in California are in hot water as administrators decide how to respond to teachers mandating that their students read books like The Kite Runner and The Bluest Eye, books that contain graphic depictions of rape, pedophilia, and incest. It is in light of these cases that we affirm the resolution. Resolved, there are certain texts with offensive languages or messages that should be banned from being used in a curriculum. To clarify the resolution, it's important to recognize that banning books is not a slippery slope. Saying that certain texts can be banned from curricula does not mean that any book can be banned anywhere for any reason. As the American Library Association explains, due to the commitment of librarians, teachers, parents, students, and other concerned citizens, most challenges are unsuccessful and most materials are retained in the school curriculum. So, before a book is actually banned, there is a process in which all parties with a stake in the matter can voice their mind about the book's value and risks. Usually, this process does not produce enough consensus to end in a ban, acting as an effective check on overzealous censorship by any group of small individuals. With this observation in mind, we agree that there are many illegitimate reasons to ban a book: politics, profanity, controversy, etc. However, our argument today is simply that there are legitimate reasons to ban certain especially harmful and violent texts. Our thesis is that banning certain books from K-12 curricula is sometimes a necessary step to ensure quality education and student safety, but it can be done in targeted ways that encourage rather than discourage freedom of expression, enriching engagement with controversial material. Our sole contention in today's debate is that we should not force children to read detailed descriptions of sexual violence. Current Common Core requirements force many children to read graphic depictions of incest, rape, and pedophilia. Banning these age-inappropriate texts from curricula is key to stop practices that are directly harmful to students' education, development, and mental health. Education advocate Marcy France writes in 2015 that Toni Morrison's 1970 novel The Bluest Eye is among Common Core's exemplar texts for 11th graders. The reason behind some parents' calls for removing the book are the graphic depictions of incest, rape, and pedophilia. And not just that, the book actually lets the reader see the depictions from the perpetrator's point of view. The author says that she wants the reader to feel as though they are a co-conspirator with the rapist. The parents do not want a complete ban on the book, nor its removal from the school. Rather, they would like it to be removed from the approved reading list in the classroom. Children do not need to be assaulted with this notion of sexual violence. The book cannot be read aloud in this class, could not be viewable if it was a movie, and couldn't be played on the stereo if it was a CD. In fact, the teachers mark the pages that can only be read at home. It's irresponsible to introduce this literature to kids when you have no idea of their past experiences with rape, incest, or violence. In case you're thinking opt out, opting your child out of reading the book doesn't protect him or her. Students that are opted out were being sent to the library for self-guided study for 3 weeks. This violates equal educational opportunity. And The Bluest Eye isn't the only example of this happening. The book Kite Runner, which includes detailed descriptions of child rape, is commonly required for 10th grade students. Reporter Anna Schaefer writes in 2016 that Holt High School parents are upset about a book in the curriculum of 10th grade students, The Kite Runner. The book has stirred up controversy due to graphic content, including the rape of the main character, Amir, detailed in the book. The book is a required read for 10th grade students at Holt High School. I don't feel this book is appropriate discussing rape of one boy by 3 other boys, said Jason Warden, a parent of Holt High School 10th grade student. The good qualities they are trying to illustrate can be found elsewhere, he said. And the consensus of studies points towards the fact that exposure to this sort of media is seriously harmful for students. In a summary of PhD psychologist Jill Manning, France goes on to explain that, as Dr. Manning points out, there is a huge difference between being labeled a mature reader and biopsychosocial maturation. The American Academy of Pediatrics states that exposure to violence in media has a significant risk on the health of adolescents and can contribute to aggressive behavior, desensitization to violence, nightmares, and fears of being harmed. The AAP has called on schools specifically to do more. There is no evidence that would suggest that this book or this kind of content is proven to be beneficial or not harmful. On the contrary, there are numerous studies from a wide range of fields showing a wide range of harmful effects. Of course, it will certainly be said that banning these books is a form of censorship, comparable to something like the burning of books by authoritarian regimes, and we understand why this may seem concerning. However, there are a couple of key reasons why our plan is quite different from these instances of censorship, and in fact is necessary to protect the expressive rights of students. First, we don't think that students should be prevented from accessing books like The Bluest Eye or The Kite Runner in libraries. Those who know that they are ready to grapple with this challenging content would still have access to it if so desired. But a student's right to read a book is very different from a teacher's right to make their students read it. And their ability to force young high schoolers to read detailed descriptions of sexual violence is clearly not something that we should prioritize over the health and safety of students themselves. Second, choosing not to include certain texts in school curricula is far from censorship. These are necessary and inevitable decisions about how to best use limited time in the classroom in the pursuit of education. School board member Mark Hemingway explains that book banning has been defined down to being making responsible decisions about what reading material is edifying and age-appropriate for school children. For better or for worse, these books are still widely available. Your local community has simply decided that finite public resources are not going to be spent disseminating them. Judgments are made all the time about what goes in school curricula for both practical and moral reasons. Ultimately, banning from using curricula is a necessary but not overly extreme response to certain texts. While they will still be widely available both within and outside of schools, having these conversations about whether we should force kids to read these explicit texts is necessary to protect the rights of students across the country.
All right, excellent. Thank you very, very much. Okay. Negative team, are you ready? All right,
I'm ready.
you are on.
Okay, just before I begin, I apologize. There may be some confusion. I'm going to be talking a bit about libraries in my speech, just because clearly something went wrong in terms of conveying the resolutions to us. But I think that many of the points that will apply to libraries, I think apply just as well for curriculum. So in this speech, I'm going to be going over the opposition's case, why we don't think that there are certain texts with offensive languages or messages that should be banned from the library or use in curriculum. The affirmation came up here and told you that they only want to ban a specific subsection of certain books. However, we think that book banning in and of itself lends to greater censorship and decreased academic freedom. We don't think that book banning has any place in our schools and our society in general, which is why we're extremely proud to oppose today's resolution. So first, I'm going to cover some definitions, which the affirmation deigned not to, which is okay. The offensive language/messages means that language/messages which cause someone to feel deeply hurt, upset, or angry. We want to note that offensiveness is generally a broader standard than obscenity. Obscenity includes specific references to graphic material, but offensiveness is a broader category. So we think that in making the standard for banning books offense, it's broadening up and opening the space for more books to be banned in general, not just because they're obscene. Ban also refers to the complete removal of a text from library use or curriculum in any context. This would include a blanket restriction on future use as well. And notably, bans almost exclusively come from a top-down decision where an authority above an individual library or teacher makes the decision to remove a certain book. Notably, banning does not include an individual teacher or an individual library choosing not to withhold a certain book or choosing not to offer one. That's not a ban. A ban is a top-down authoritative measure which restricts use in the first place. Our first contention, and pardon me if this is not directly as responsive to their case, but is that we ought not to ban books from libraries. We believe that public libraries are especially they're special institutions and places where books of all kinds should be brought, and new and interesting ideas should be debated and challenged. But the idea of banning books is antithetical to that. According to the American Library Association, public libraries are some of the places most frequently targeted by those seeking to take certain books off shelves. And we think banning books in these contexts is especially troubling, since calls for bans usually come from vocal minorities rather than a silent majority. My opponent claimed that the book banning process or the book banning procedure allows the incorporation of many different voices and perspectives, but we would like to push back on this idea. If a parent or a student doesn't have the time to resist a certain book banning decision or a certain book banning discussion, if they have to go to work, if they have to care for their families, they're ultimately not going to be able to get their voice as heard in these types of arbitrations. And we think that inherently excludes people which would otherwise have a voice. Furthermore, banning books in certain libraries opens up the door to future censorship. ALA data shows that when calls are made for banning certain books are successful, there is a concurrent rise in the request to ban non-book material, such as displays or posters. We think this is a clear example of what scholars call a chilling effect, where restrictions on one form of speech lend themselves to other, perhaps more extraneous restrictions. Public libraries ought to be bastions of open discourse, not places where that thought is subject to meticulous limitation. The same goes for school libraries. The active restriction of text in school libraries is a violation of the First Amendment. In Board of Education v. PICO, the Supreme Court ruled that books could not be banned in school libraries simply due to the ideas contained within them. The court held that as centers for voluntary inquiry and the dissemination of free information and ideas, school libraries enjoy a special affinity with the rights of free speech and free press. Our second argument is that banning books from curriculums unduly hurts free speech and education. So I think we can cross-apply many of the same arguments that I brought over from the library example. We think the chilling effect applies just as much, where you ban one specific type of book, but then that lends credibility to other bans of specific books. They say that, oh, we're going to keep these bans to, for instance, The Kite Runner or In the Bluest Eye. But I want to mention a lot of the books that we take for granted as acceptable in high schools do feature explicit discussions of these of rape and sexual assault. I know in my English class in high school, I read I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. This is a terrific book. It's a book that many students should read because it contains very detailed, very personal discussions of racism and race and sexuality and growing up, but it also contains graphic descriptions of violence. We don't think that just because these violent scenes are depicted that we have to suddenly remove all those benefits, all those positive discussions that come from those books. Furthermore, we also think that in many instances, having these types of scenes in books, scenes that are graphic, can actually help prompt discussions. We recognize that some people might feel uncomfortable with those decisions, but we think in many instances that can be used as a valuable springboard to discuss how those problems arise in society and how people can approach them individually. We think that a lot of the books that are, they specify that they only want to ban these types of books, but once again, those types of bans are pretty much always used to continually expand the level of books being banned, which is why you get calls for ban of The Color Purple or To Kill a Mockingbird, two books that take a very honest but accessible approach to issues of racism, gender discrimination, and sexuality. Furthermore, we disagree completely that the idea that reading banned books is always going to lead to some sort of negative effects happening. A study in the Journal of Psychology of Aesthetics, Creativity, and the Arts in 2014 shows that the reading of banned books did not predict GPA or commission of violent or nonviolent acts. Furthermore, the reading of banned books was actually associated with increased civic behaviors, such as seeking out new ideas or criticizing those in power. So we can see that in trying to ban specific books, the affirmation is opening up a whole can of worms, which we don't think we need to get into. Our third argument is that we can employ alternatives to ensure that certain offensive texts are treated correctly. We understand that offensive language, like the kind they specified, might not be appropriate to feature in classrooms on its own, which is why we can turn to alternatives as a better way to teach these texts. We support the practice of contextualizing offensive texts, wherein a teacher presents specific passages of the text and then offers relevant outside information concerning the context of it, and or students reading outside secondary sources like articles, which critically analyze the text and offer more appropriate context. But the affirmation would prefer to simply ban the text entirely, meaning you couldn't access any parts of these books in student curriculums in libraries in general. This is why we're extremely proud to oppose, and we hope you do as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So now we enter the second part of the debate, at which point the participants are to ask each other questions. And as I said at the opening, judges, if you have questions that you would like to ask, please put them in the chat and then I will moderate those. So let's just see, would somebody like to begin?
I'd like to begin. We are completely sympathetic to the studies you say and the arguments you made about like these types of scenes, for instance, in The Kite Runner not being appropriate for children. But do you also concede that a book like The Kite Runner is very valuable for children in that it depicts a refugee story, the experience of migration, the experience of war, and that these are the types of messages that do you agree that these are the types of messages that students in a critical learning environment should be exposed to?
Yeah, so we absolutely agree. And we do think that there's a lot of value to a lot of these controversial texts. The thing is that it's not entirely necessary to specifically read the book, The Kite Runner, and to specifically read a detailed description of 3 boys raping another boy. I mean, that's a very extreme way to get across these ideas, if it's even necessary to start with. So the fact that that is also part of the book means that I think we can do any number of things to get that same value. Like the parent talked about, who is a parent of a Holt High School 10th grade student, we can get that value in other ways, either from reading the book in a library if a child really feels that they're ready for it, or reading it later in life when they're more mature, or just replacing the book in a curriculum with another text that addresses those same themes. There are plenty of ways to get that value. We don't need to have kids read about child rape to get that value.
Just to add on to what Christian was saying, for that specific example, The Kite Runner, I think Exit West by Moshe Hamid would be a very good replacement because there aren't graphic depictions of sexual violence in that, but it still deals with the issues of migration, refugees, war, displacement, and borders in much of the same ways, which means we can still talk about those controversial issues. We just don't have the potential to potentially hurt students psychologically.
Makes sense. I think that the idea that we have to ban these books is frankly quite extreme. Frequently, teachers nowadays employ the use of trigger warnings, which we can go back and forth on whether those actually help certain students, but we think there are alternatives. Furthermore, teachers can use just assign specific sections of the book. If a teacher recognizes that perhaps part of the book is not appropriate or would cause harm, then they can still assign sections of the book and they can still assign chapters which do not deal with that sexual assault or rape. But the problem with the affirmation is that they're using the process of banning a book, and banning is very directly removing the book from the curriculum. So any of the positive value which could be gained from it is no longer accessible.
And if I can add a question to that, you also mentioned, Malhar, in your opening speech that banning from curricula doesn't mean that they won't have access to those books. So I'm trying to understand let's say Kite Runner gets banned from that 10th grade high school, but do you agree that those books can still be accessed by those students and that you won't have the effect? If the idea is no one should read that book because it leads to violence, I'm just trying to understand what it's preventing. If you ban it from curricula, but you still have access to the book, how does it exactly make the difference?
Yeah, thank you, Akash, for your question. I think the key point is that when they're in libraries, it is a student's choice to pick up the book and read it and stop if they would like. Whereas in curricula, students are forced to read books for a grade, and there's often no alternatives that they can successfully use in those scenarios. In which case, forcing students to read texts that may potentially traumatize them or cause psychological harm is something that we strongly oppose. But that doesn't mean we can't still talk about controversial issues and have fruitful discussions about the same issues that appear in multiple texts.
Can I also say, you say that books that would cause psychological harm, it's almost impossible to predict which books will cause psychological harm. There could be books which, well, you choose the specific example of pedophilia, rape, and incest. But again, offense is a much broader term. There could be seemingly non-offensive books which causes trauma to a student. It's entirely possible. Like, I'm just reading let's say there's a student who comes from a war-torn country, and then reading a book about war, which no one else finds offensive, gives him flashbacks of his home country, of what he has suffered, of what his ancestors have gone through. That's causing immense psychological harm. So I'm trying to understand how you set that dial, how you exactly determine which books, because the moment you say psychological harm, any kind of psychological harm to students, that's like not just rape, pedophilia, incest, that's like thousands of other books which could have exactly the same effect. So how do you judge that? What's the metric here?
Yeah. So the way that we would actually say is we determine what books should be banned and what should not, and what is actually happening already right now, as we see the American Library Association quote that we read at the top of our case, is that first an individual goes and challenges the book. This is the instances, all of the instances in the negative talk about how there are calls to ban a book or how there are calls for further censorship. That's what that represents. It's an individual challenging a book, which then leads to a larger discussion within the community, where the people who are going to make the decision about whether the book should get banned are subject to pressure from all sorts of different groups who have a stake in students' education. You have people like parents, you have the students themselves who should clearly have a say in their own education, and you have really like qualified, educated people in child psychology like Jill Manning, as we cite in our case, we think should all have a say in deciding whether or not a certain book does get banned. We think that it's important for that conversation to happen, and we do say that there are only certain very extreme books that are going to get banned once we go through that process. Again, as the quote at the top of our case says, only a very small amount of challenges that are issued actually turn into bans. So when you say things like there are calls to ban a book, an individual parent might request that a book get banned, that's true, but we don't think that that leads to censoring of free speech. We think that means that we're able to engage in a larger conversation where everybody who has a stake in this is able to have their voice heard, and then ultimately the book is only really banned if it's very egregious.
I want to just push back on this idea that bans, like one ban is going to stop at one ban and not going to further like proliferate. So I have two main responses. First, we've read you data from the American Library Association, which shows that when a ban in, say, a library is successful, there is an uptick in challenges and sometimes ban against non-book material, right? So something like a display or a poster, and maybe one specific poster is profane or obscene and doesn't have a place in a library, but we think that we want to broaden the discussion to what the environment of book banning creates, right? Because it's implicitly allowing that when you ban one book for, again, trauma, which like Akash said is already fraught, and is already subject to interpretation and the student's own experience. When you start laying out these standards and start laying out this groundwork, you make it easier to ban other books in the future, right? Think about the book that I cited from my own personal experience, I Know Where the Caged Bird Sings. Based on their description, that could easily be banned. So it's not just a specific subset of text. It's these bans can apply to a very broad range of books. We also want to push back on the idea that like sexual assault, as graphic and obviously as horrible as it is, that discussions of sexual assault don't have a place in a classroom. It is a real thing that happens. Unfortunately, it often happens to young people. So to say that it doesn't have like discussions of sexual assault, provocative discussions of sexual assault don't have a place in the classroom, I think is really misguided, because at the end of the day, that's the world that we live in. And we think it's far better for students to be exposed to at least some element of that than none at all.
Yeah, so just to respond to this idea that it is a good idea to have these very graphic depictions of sexual assault in the classroom, we think that, first of all, this is in a lot of cases simply not true, especially in these cases like examples of The Bluest Eye, where it's an explicit scene of a pedophile doing what they do and justifying it all at the same time. So first of all, we agree that like some of these instances are not going to be that bad. Like there are still some instances where the description is not graphic enough to warrant extreme concern. But as Professor Jill Manning talks about, and as we cite in our case, PhD psychologists and the consensus of studies on this issue show that children of this age are not always ready to come to grips with that content without having serious negative psychological effects. And second of all, I would say the fact that this is something that actually happens to a lot of these students in the real world is not a reason why we should be leaping to force them to relive those experiences. I think we should be very wary of the idea of making somebody who has already gone through an instance of pedophilia or rape to read, for example, as The Bluest Eye does have in it, a graphic depiction of a father raping his daughter. These are serious issues that we don't take lightly, and it's something that we should do something about.
I don't think or go for it, Akash. Yes.
Oh, no, I was simply saying, like, I'm looking at the case you present as a whole, and I can see that the case is really narrowly focused on like a few things. So number one, you instead of the resolution, deals with offensive languages or messages, and I'm wondering why you choose only one subset of offensive languages, which is rape, pedophilia, and sexual assault. There's, as I said, many other kinds of offensive languages which can psychologically harm people. The second thing you do is, I think, the examples you were citing, number one, they are usually from high schools, 10th, 11th, 12th grade. So this idea that kids who are 15, 16, 18 will not be able to deal with these traumatic ideas, which I'm sure many of them are already familiar with. I would like to push back on that. So basically what I'm saying is, why narrowly focus the definition of offensive down to sexual assault, rape, and pedophilia? Secondly, I'm trying to question the prevalence of the issue.
Right. I think this is a very good question. I think that the resolution is saying that sometimes there are certain reasons for very certain specific texts that should be banned from use in a curriculum. We think that although, yes, there is a gray area, as you have pointed out, that there's lots of things that could lead to psychological violence, there are some things that we know for sure are likely age inappropriate for students or could cause more psychological damage. And things like The Bluest Eye, which is literally a pedophile justifying their actions and engaging in these violent acts. We think that's the issues that The Bluest Eye deals with can be done through another format and in another book without that psychological violence. The reason we narrow it is because the resolution is asking a narrow question. It's asking if there are certain reasons to justify banning certain texts. And we have narrowed it that, yes, there are legitimate reasons to ban very specific texts that we can know for sure. We agree there's a big area on what exactly is psychological damage to students, but we know for sure that these texts are likely to cause that and is a justification for removing them from curricula, but not from schools.
I just want to, again, stretch, again, if you take the opposition line and you extend it to its furthest conclusion, then you would ban far more books than they actually specify, right? You would ban far more books that deal with more serious issues because, again, those can, books that deal with racial trauma like Black Boy or I Know Why Caged Bird Sings or To Kill a Mockingbird, right? These are controversial books that in some people would undoubtedly cause psychological harm. But because this, and they're saying that their standard is very specific. It's only referring to psychological harm for the books that they mentioned. But this standard can be used broadly, extremely broadly, to easily ban the books that I've talked about. And this is especially harmful, especially when there are communities who don't particularly want students to learn about the history of racism in this country, how people have experienced it, the history of gender violence or gender discrimination. We think that it's far better for students to be learning these controversial issues, even if there is the possibility of trauma, because they are exposed to issues which fundamentally have shaped our society. And when you learn more, when you read To Kill a Mockingbird, for instance, you get a first-person understanding of how racism impacts a town, get a first-person understanding of what it has looked like historically. We think that's far more important for students to be learning. And we push back on the idea that this standard is only going to be used for a very specific number of cases, when we've already proven how this standard easily applies to more and more and more books.
Right. And I think those are very justifiable concerns, but I also think it's really important to look at what happens when this occurs in real life. Again, as we talked about at the beginning of our case, it's true that opening the door to the idea of banning does create a lot of calls to ban more things, which is precisely what the other team's evidence is about, and precisely what every example they explain in their case and in the round is so far. The important thing to note about this is that we don't have any examples of this definition or this concept of offensive language actually being stretched to ban a book that is clearly a bad idea to ban. At the end of the day, you see that when we do engage in these processes where every person in the community who has a stake in these child's education has their voice heard and gets to speak about whether or not this is appropriate, we do end up seeing most of those challenges fail. We do end up seeing that we don't get these ridiculous slippery slope bans that the negative is afraid of. So while I do think it is a very valid concern, and it could be a problem in some cases, it's ultimately just unrealistic.
But I'm not using a slippery slope ban standard. I'm using your standard, which you said a text should be banned for these reasons, right? If you're arguing that a text should be banned for these reasons, why can't a parent legitimately argue that To Kill a Mockingbird should be banned because it leads to psychological trauma?
Right. And what we're saying is we think that they should make those arguments. But again, when we look in real life, they don't end up being successful in cases like To Kill a Mockingbird. I'm wondering if the negative side in this round can actually come up with a concrete example of a time when this happened in real life.
Well, I think the reason why that this usually doesn't happen in real life is because most people, at least in the US, value things like free speech. They're ingrained with this idea. So I'm actually going to use the example you just gave. So the whole premise is, which you're painting with the opening, with the statements you have made so far, is that certain books should be banned because they cause psychological harm. But then you also go on to say that, as the Library Association shows, that when most of these cases are brought up, they lose. Those books end up not getting banned. So I'm trying to connect the book, like those 2 points. You can't say that those books should be banned and also say that, oh, but in real life, those books don't get banned. So the psychological harm which you are trying to prevent, it's not happening in the real world. Like I think both of those contentions are contradictory.
I would like to clarify. We are not saying that we should ban books broadly because they cause psychological harm. We are saying that graphic depictions of sexual violence that have the possibility to do that thing of psychological harm is the specific reason. I think that you all are maybe broadening what our claim is a little too much. We are narrowly focusing that there are very specific reasons in very specific contexts when it might be a good idea to ban a book. And
Okay.
saying that ban itself doesn't lead to more bans, as you've claimed, the evidence that you cited that it led to an uptick in challenges. We claim that that uptick in challenges actually increases the speech about the value of texts and the impact that they have on the communities surrounding them. So it means that more people in the communities where people are being educated have a voice to speak about a process that affects all of us in the shaping of an independent critical thinker and a citizen.
To really quickly clarify, I would like to provide just a clear resolutional backing for the why we're saying only certain text should be banned, is because, to quote the resolution, it says certain texts should be banned from curricula or from libraries. So we don't need to necessarily say that every text with anything that could be considered an offensive message should be banned. I mean, I think that's pretty clearly ridiculous, but there are certain ones that clearly are.
Okay, I just have a quick question because I think, Maha, you brought up a very interesting point, right? So your standard is psychological, like we should ban books that cause specifically deal with graphic depictions of sexual violence, right? But the reasoning is because they cause psychological harm, correct?
I think
the reason why you ban those specific that specific depiction is because it causes harm, correct?
The reason is because it overwhelmingly causes harm, and it is hard for students to grapple with that in classrooms in a meaningful way that can achieve what you're talking about in your case in terms of free expression and understanding complex issues.
Okay.
A lot of times those graphic depictions may shut down conversation altogether because of its shock and its potential trauma.
Okay, so going off of that, what is the difference between that and graphic depictions of violence in a political context, violence in a racial context? Like why are those different, or are they different?
We think that's a very complex question that is a bit less clear cut than sexual violence, which is why we make the argument that there is a legitimate reason when concerning with sexual violence, that that is a legitimate reason to ban things. The other questions of like racial or political violence are broader questions that can be addressed by a broader community. But our case is specifically that the legitimate reason that we bring forward for banning text is a graphic depiction of sexual violence.
I think, or go for it, Akash.
Yeah, I think we are treading in we're going into a risky space. Like if you make the claim that when it comes to racial violence, it's more muddy and it's more like it's more complex and hard to understand. First, I don't think we should be comparing these kinds of violence in the first place. That sexual violence has more legitimacy than racial violence. And again, I find it hard to see how you would compare the amounts of trauma. Like, I'd also like to apologize before I think I said psychological harm. Okay, if you're against books which have graphic depictions of sexual violence, but then you again claim that most challenges which are brought up, they lose. I think you'll have to defend that those books should still be banned. Like if there's a committee which, let's say, decides whether the Kite Runner should be in the syllabus, and most people in that committee, most parents and children decide that, oh, Kite Runner is fine. It should be a book which most people read. But there's some people who are exposed to the graphic depictions of sexual violence, and they go through trauma. I think you'll have to defend that despite the decision of that committee, despite the decision of the majority of parents, that book should still be banned, right?
I think what the affirmative is defending is that we think there are legitimate reasons to ban certain books. We are not defending that communities across the country are suddenly going to pick up our reason and use it to ban books. Our response that when a book is banned for a legitimate reason and it increases the amount of complaints or claims to ban other books, it is specifically to say that when people bring claims about trying to ban books, there isn't a slippery slope where one standard will be cross-applied to a bunch of other books because of how the banning process works in terms of community involvement as one unit.
I want to actually respond to that, because I think it's a bit spurious to say that bans which exist in one context aren't going to be used to justify bans in another context. That's a lot of the ground of legal precedent, especially in regards to, we've seen education, right? One book is banned, or a banning on one specific book is overturned, so people use that as precedent for legal claims against or for the banning or unbanning of another book. So to say that these exist independently of each other, that communities, lawyers, that people caught up in these issues aren't going to try to use specific examples of books being banned as a way to try to ban other books, and then by creating one standard, by creating one ground where you say this is legitimately successful, like this is legitimate, you are inherently opening the door for other people. Perhaps they make perhaps like not the best claims to those, but it creates the precedent for those claims to be justified, because they say, look, this book is similar to the book I want to be challenged. This school district banned this on supposedly legal reasons based on your framework. I want this book banned in my school as well. And I think that's like what happens all the time. So to say that this is independent and this isn't going to cause future bannings, I think is really, it's short-sighted, really.
Yeah. And I think that, again, is a very valid concern. Like, I think that when you just look at this resolution in a vacuum without looking at what happens in real life, you can see how, like, opening the door to a ban might seem scary. That's what slippery slope arguments are all about. ultimately, we see that what ends up happening is that communities do not have these massive bannings of books. And again, I will ask you the question, if you can come up with a single instance of this slippery slope happening, of a book being banned that is very clearly a bad idea to ban after that initial ban.
Well, I would say that you can look at books such as To Kill a Mockingbird, Why the Caged Bird Sings. I don't have a specific example of them being banned, but okay, here's my argument, right?
Right.
I think that in the real world, precedent applies, right? In the real world, people use these cases to justify the creation of future bans, especially when you give a legitimate, a framework, a reason saying you should ban these books, not these books. When you codify that, when you apply it in an authoritative way, saying this is the standard. If books don't meet the standard, then they get banned. That is very easy. It's not just a slippery slope because it has logical weight to it. And like I told you in my opening speech, there's data which shows that when book bans are successful, I mean, this is in libraries, so take it with a grain of salt, but I think it's exactly what you're asking for. When book challenges on books in libraries are successful, there is a rise in challenges on non-book speech, such as posters or displays. And when there's a rise in those challenges, there is inevitably going to be a rise in the number of challenges that are successful.
Right. And again, I really want to emphasize that it's a rise in the number of challenges. Ultimately, again, not all of those challenges are successful. Of course, some of them will be, but we give examples that show that there are certain texts, specifically in school curricula, that actually are worthy of banning. There are certain texts where we can say it is unreasonable and it is a bad idea to have kids reading about graphic depictions of rape, incest, and pedophilia, especially in texts that explicitly are apologetic towards those things at the same time. So ultimately, yes, some of those challenges will be successful. We don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it may be necessary.
All right, let's thank you for a very healthy discussion. We are now going to make the closing arguments. They should go 4 to 5 minutes. Again, I'll put my finger up at 4 and interrupt you at 5. But are you ready for the closing? Okay, you are on.
Okay, so let's start off by talking about this idea of the slippery slope, which we've been discussing for a large chunk of this debate. So our opponents have consistently upheld that any call for a ban on any individual book and any successful ban is just going to lead to more calls to ban. Ultimately, they're going to be more successful. And they cite this evidence that talks about how when a challenge is successful, there are more challenges. Ultimately, some of those will be successful too. Now, what they're describing as more censorship, more calls for bans, we describe as part of a larger community conversation in which everybody's voices can be heard. Everybody's voices who have a stake in the education of our children in this country, which includes parents, people who we also think should have an understanding and a say in what their children are taught, professional psychologists and child psychologists like Jill Manning, who we cite in our case, and of course, the students themselves. So while we're talking about how, ultimately there's going to be more bans, really what's happening is that there are more challenges, there's more discussion, there's more people who get their voices heard, and that is ultimately what's best for free speech. So when we look at the question of whether or not this is a slippery slope, maybe, but if it is, it's a slippery slope to more discussion and more fruitful understanding in the marketplace of ideas. Again, look to the fact that our opponents in this round cannot come up with a single example of the slippery slope actually happening, a single example where the community discussion ended with a negative outcome. At that point, there really isn't a clear downside to taking these books that are clearly very harmful for students and saying, yeah, we should leave the door open to ban those. So let's talk about those books. Let's talk about the severity of some texts and whether or not we should advocate for banning all books that people want to ban. So again, we would point you towards the text of the resolution, which says there are certain texts which ought to be banned from curricula or from libraries. We say that there are certain texts. We give you examples of certain texts with The Bluest Eye and Kite Runner. Again, books that contain graphic depictions of incest, rape, and pedophilia. as clear examples of cases where we should ban this book. That in itself, the fact that these cases exist, that they're out there, is enough to say, yes, the resolution is true. There are certain cases where we ought to ban these books. Now, again, we have this idea that our logic justifies banning other books if even a single parent wants to get it banned. But of course, that's ridiculous. Again, that's why we have these discussions with the entire community, where everybody gets to have their voice heard, where everybody gets to have a say in the conversation about what we teach our children, who will then grow up to inherit the country of the United States. So it's clear that there are very harmful effects to children when we look to these things. We have evidence from PhD psychologist Jill Manning, another person who we think should be part of that conversation, who says the consensus of academic studies, after doing a thorough research of it, is that these books are harmful, that depictions of violence can result in fear for children, can result in increases in violence and generally trauma for the children that we teach in our schools. So at the end of the day, the question is, do we want to be allowing even the chance of banning certain very harmful texts like The Bluest Eye, like Kite Runner, and other very similarly harmful texts? And we think that if you believe in free speech and the voices of every member of the community being heard, not just the teachers who decide the curriculum, we should vote for the affirmative. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'll begin by saying that I was quite nervous when Malhar and gave the opening statement, because we are talking about sexual assault, pedophilia, and rape, and I was thinking, how would I even argue against these things? I mean, no reasonable person condones any of these things, right? And then I had this emotional reaction that I can't think of any argument against any of the things they said. But I think the confusion here is being caused because the confusion here is that they're not really arguing for the resolution. So the resolution again is that certain texts should be banned. But Christian just spent 3 minutes talking about how there should be a democratic process where everyone's voices should be heard, where people, teachers, and experts should get together and they should discuss what books should be read and what books should not be in the curricula, right? This is not banning. This is people getting together to decide what a school's curricula should look like. They're not arguing like they should be arguing something like these are certain books that should be banned, but the solution they provide doesn't look like a banning process. It looks like a democratic process where people are getting together and deciding what books should be read. I think I'd also like to let me give you a hypothetical. Think of yourself as a high school student. You're trying to navigate through life. You're trying to figure out your political views. You're not as naive. You know about the bad things that happen in the world, and that does include sexual violence, pedophilia, rape. You know that these things exist, and I think at that moment, if anything's going to help, it's going to be open access to as many books as possible. To understand the trauma, I think these books do have value in the sense that they can actually put you in the shoes of a person who has been through that trauma. And I think after reading those books, as a high school student, you'll come out better informed. You'll be more knowledgeable and educated, and hopefully against these kinds of exploitations. The other problem, which I think the other problem with the affirmations case is they specifically focus on graphic depictions of sexual violence, and they claim that this is the only thing which leads to trauma. But I think that's an unjustifiable claim. I think there's many other kinds of trauma which might be more severe. There could be trauma from history, so race relations, how certain races and how certain people of certain religion have been treated in the past. So this idea that there should be one standard should be applied for this one sect of books, graphic violence, graphic sexual violence. I think that's unjustified, and I think the affirmation should have also explained why other kinds of trauma, texts that produce other kinds of trauma, should not also be banned. In the end, I think I would just say that I think we all want to live in a world where we have access to all kinds of books and texts, where we have access to all kinds of information, and there's no big brother deciding what we should be able to read and what we should not be able to read. And if you agree with that, I think you should vote with the negative. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Truly, thank you to all four of you for a very, very thoughtful, nuanced discussion about a very sensitive topic. So you did a marvelous job. And judges, thank you once again for your extraordinary contributions to higher education and creating this more thoughtful civil society.
Thank you so much.
For judging.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hope everyone has a nice day.
Okay.
Thank you. Good luck.
Bravo.
Bye-bye.